So welcome to Indylive Extra. A month or so back, we interviewed Mike Russell, who's president of the SNP, and he's currently doing a lot of thinking and talking to various yes groups about how to write a constitution, a provisional constitution for Scotland, and what to put in it. So we asked, would you do an interview with us? He said yes, and here it is. So welcome everyone. It's another edition of the Indy Jigsaw Show, and the theme for this month's edition is the Constitution, a possible constitution for an independent Scotland. We've got various guests coming on with us, but this particular one, I'm sitting here, as it were, with Mike Russell, president of the SNP, but of course also been an MSP in Holyrood for a great many years. So, Mike, I've already said to you that the basis for this show, Indy Jigsaw Show, is we only have one assumption, and that is that by the end of 2023, Scots will have decided to become independent. And from that basic premise, we sort of say, okay, what kind of country do we want? What kind of things do we want to do more of? What do we want to do less of? Where do we want to shift direction? So the thing about thinking about the Constitution is, well, I guess, Independence Day +1, there might be jitters. How do we give a sense of stability to institutions, or even just reassurance to people? So that's what we'd like to talk about, and in particular, how we do that with Scotland. But I thought, could we start to begin with and just kind of put it in the perspective of where things are now, because here we are we're in the UK. It doesn't have a written constitution. What do you think yourself about, what are the pros and cons?
It's very odd that we live in a country without essentially a codified constitution. There are bits of written constitutions. You could say that the Scotland Act is a bit of a written constitution, but of course this is all subsumed in this 18th and 19th century idea of Westminster sovereignty, that whatever happens, Westminster is in charge and cannot ever be gainsaid by anybody, and that devolution is essentially a delicate dance around that concept of Westminster sovereignty. So that creates an unreality. If any parliament believes it is so important and so mighty that it cannot be gainsaid, and indeed now it doesn't even look as if a prime minister has to answer to anybody but himself. In all those circumstances, we need to step away from that and to say what would reasonable citizens expect in the country in which they live, not subjects, but reasonable citizens expect in the 21st century in the country in which they live. So there is a crying demand, a need for a written codified constitution that we all know where we stand. And not only, and that will bring us on to the issue of a transitional constitution, not only where we stand and are going to stand, but how we get from one to the other. Because the process of independence is extremely important. I absolutely buy into the idea that in 2023 people will have the chance, we hope, to vote, and I buy into the idea that I want them to vote for that. But then, voting for it, we have to make it happen, and that means taking the will of the people and converting that into a set of arrangements that allows Scotland to become independent and to join the world. And to a great extent, that's what a transitional constitution is about. It's not about the final outcome. It's not about how you and I might want to see Scotland as an independent country, and we can certainly talk about that. And we all got ideas, and I think very radical ideas. It's how we get from A to B, and it's how we offer the reassurance to those people who did not support it that process can take place in an orderly fashion, and that's what we're engaged in the moment.
Yeah. So, do you want to say a bit about how you've been going about that, just to inform people?
I have to say I've come slightly late to it. There have been various attempts at constitutions. The great Neil McCormack, of course, had more than a passing acquaintanceship with this issue and drafted a constitution. Others have attempted to draft constitutions, but they've all been on the basis, this is how we want Scotland to look when we are independent. I was skeptical about the issue of being engaged in that now. When I was Cabinet Secretary for the Constitution, it seemed to me that we had to essentially get independence, or get people to vote for independence before we did anything else. But I got persuaded in two ways, and I might have been wrong about that and was wrong about that. One was by Elliot Bulmer, who is a constitutional specialist and lawyer, and somebody who has been involved in drafting constitutions and is still involved in drafting constitutions as an academic and expert. And the other really was the experience of talking to people across the yes movement who wanted something that would provide the framework for us to work together after a yes vote to get to that moment of independence and beyond it. So last year, when Nicola had asked me to provide some political direction to some of these issues within the party, I approached a number of yes organizations, not all SNP by any manner of means, and said, how about working together to see if we could get that transitional constitution on the grounds that if the wider yes movement bought into it, then it had a chance of succeeding and providing something that was useful. And once that had been agreed and we'd had that conversation and people had come on board, a range of organizations had come on board, then we commissioned Elliot Bulmer to write a draft. That happened. The draft exists. It is being looked at by those organizations. And I hope that shortly, and everything takes time, I hope that shortly we'll have a second draft and then we can begin to consult on that. Now, we can't consult in the way that a government consults. I mean, that's beyond us. But we can consult about what this should look like. Now, in the process of doing this, some people have seemed to have got the wrong end of the stick and have been waving it quite vigorously. This is not a finished constitution. This is not it. There are things that won't be in that because they haven't been agreed. And we'll come to that in a moment. Things like the monarchy and things like that, which we can have opinions on, but we're not actually in a position to say this is what's going to happen in a transitional constitution. But it should provide the reassurance and the framework to allow us to become independent. And it doesn't have to be anodyne. There are things in it that are really important. For example, a single chamber parliament and no House of Lords is an obvious thing. And therefore, if there's no House of Lords, there's no room for titles and such things. So those just go because they go with the current constitutional structures. So that's the work's being done. I hope at some stage this year we'll have a second draft. We will be able to talk about that second draft. And then if that can get agreed or reasonably widely agreed, then I think it's up to the Scottish Government as we move forward, because in the event of a yes vote, which I very much hope will take place, that's when you start to bring this in, you start to get it in place for a date at which it becomes effective. And what we have now stops being so, and we move to that transitional constitution, and we make a commitment. Really, final point, sorry to go on too long on this, but it's really important. At that point, we have to set a date and a procedure to have the final constitution, and that the transitional constitution will mandate that. Now, my own position, the SNP position on this, is that there should be a type of citizens' assembly. The people of Scotland should be involved, including those who did not vote for independence, in deciding what that final constitution is. I was involved in setting up the Citizens' Assembly in Scotland, the one we had 2 years ago. I very much believe that that's the right way to do it. So I want the transitional constitution to mandate a period of time in which that has to take place and how it will take place. If you leave it too long, then that's not good.
Yeah. So maybe at this point, I should probably say, but in the interest of transparency, kind of say that I'm one of the people who's involved in this consultative group that Mike set up. That I'm there on behalf of Pensioners for Independence. Myself and my colleague from Pensioners for Independence, we were very pleased to be asked, and then you emailed us the draft version of it, and I have to say I kind of wilted. I thought, wow, and it's I mean, how many pages? And it's over 50 pages.
Yeah.
It's over 50 pages. So for anyone watching, I'll just say this to you: it takes quite a lot of determination to go through those 50 pages with a bit of a fine tooth comb, because that's what you asked us. You asked all the groups to do: read it, send back comments, any additions, things we thought could be better. And it's a lot of it is, well, I'll just put it this way, it's a lot of it seemed to me to be absolutely essential that sort of thing was in a constitution, worthy but sort of boring.
Nuts and bolts.
It's important, yeah.
Absolutely, you've got to have it.
Yeah, you've got to have it. It really depends.
The reason it's taken a bit of time too is because it's not just Women for Indy, Pensions for Indy, but commenting. There was a whole range of bodies, and all that stuff had to be collated. Now, I think Elliot has almost finished that task, and I hope we'll be able to move on after the local elections to begin to work on that. But yes, I mean, there are things in it which, you would have to be a constitutional obsessive to find that interesting. There are other really important things in it. I mean, many of us would want to see something done about the issue of land ownership. But the question of whether you can put that into a transitional constitution or whether that becomes an issue for a final constitution is a moot point. I don't know is the answer to that. And out of the next round of this discussion, I think we're going to resolve that and find a way to resolve it.
Yes. That hopefully that would be the case. So just to be sort of clear about what might happen. So Elliot's going to be looking through all our comments and coming up with a version 2. At some point there'll be more discussion, but at some point, if I'm correct, then your intention is to put that to the Scottish government and ask it to be put to Holyrood.
Eventually, the next stage in this is where the organisations involved will come back together. They've already given their submissions. It took, as ever, longer than we had hoped. Some people were slow, some people lost it, some people forgot. But anyway, there it is. It's there. I hope, as I say, after local elections, some stage we'll sit down, I hope face to face for the first time. This has all been done virtually so far. We'll come to a conclusion of what the second draft looks like. We'll then ask the organisations to talk about that second draft to their members and to see what their members think, to widen the pool out a bit. And then we'll get, we hope, to a final draft. Now, that final draft, I'm then open to what we do, but my own view is that we should publish that final draft at that stage. I mean, there's no point in publishing it now because there's so much detail in it. We'll publish that final draft and we'll give it to the Scottish Government and we'll say, that's been arranged and agreed by these bodies, and in this way, we hope that is an important contribution to the development of a transitional constitution. Now, in 2014, towards the very end of the campaign, the Scottish Government did publish a sort of draft constitution, but I think everybody would accept it was a bit of an afterthought. I hope this time things will be much more better prepared, and you have seen even the first draft. I think that document does contain what we need in order to move from A to B. But there's also another point, is the point of reassurance. If you have people who find this process worrying, who are against this process or against independence, we have to say to them, look, your rights are guaranteed and absolutely guaranteed. The rights and privileges that you have now will be guaranteed. Privileges is a loose word. I'm not talking about being a member of the House of Lords, but the things you have as a citizen, you will continue to have. And there are examples in other places where that process has not necessarily protected those who were against change, and therefore we have to be able to provide that protection and reassurance. So the Constitution has to provide that too. It has to provide a defence for individual citizens.
Yeah. So does that mean then that final version, or final as far as our group is concerned, that will have been maybe put to the Scottish Government, does that mean that then that would be, well, in a way, part and parcel of the Indy 2 campaign when it happens? Because people would need to know, but people could know in advance, well, okay, I might not be in favour of this, but at least I know, my human rights are safe, or
That is important, but also I think we have to say to people, look, I think, my view is that the coming independence referendum will be different from the last one. And one of the reasons it'll be different is because we've got far more people involved and far more organizations involved and far more versions of what we all want to see. So we're going to have to accept difference of opinion, and perhaps in 2014 we didn't do enough of that. So what the Constitution also is a shared space where we're guaranteeing things and protections to people, although they have different visions. And we're saying to them, once we are independent, then we can contend for the final version, but also contend for government. And government itself will change that. You could, I think it's highly unlikely, but you could elect a government in Scotland that didn't want to change land ownership, and that would be legitimate. I mean, I wouldn't support it, and I'd do my best not to make sure it wasn't elected, but that would be legitimate. So we also have to, in our minds, be clear that there are those things that are embedded in the Constitution, and there are those things that are a matter of government. And that's also a process we need to go through.
Yes, yes, indeed. And in the I think it's in the preliminaries to the draft that Elliot's done. He talks about it being a defensive document.
Yes.
That's not rocking the boat sort of document.
Well, yeah, the word defensive, I think, is used in a very legalistic sort of word there. It allows essentially to defend individuals. I'm not sure it doesn't rock the boat. I mean, I think the very idea of a written constitution rocks the UK boat and should rock the UK boat.
Yeah.
I think what it is there are some issues. Let's touch on the most difficult of them, which is the issue of the head of state. There are some issues which, I don't believe can be resolved in a transitional constitution, but they can be resolved in a final constitution. I've always taken the view that it is important we get to independence before we start bashing each other over the head about who's going to be the head of state or stuff. But I'm not in any sense worried about it, because I can live very happily with the idea which we have a Scottish Republic. And that's just as easy for me to accept as a limited constitutional monarchy. I don't have any strong feelings about it, but I don't think we'll resolve it at this stage. Now, we might be able to, but I think it's more likely that we will resolve it at a future stage in a final constitutional process. And therefore, what this needs to do is to provide an improvement, a modernization on it. And the Constitution does make some changes to it, but it has not produced a final answer to that question. And of course, the SNP position has always been the Queen would remain as the head of state, or the monarch would remain as head of state, as long as the Scottish people wanted them. But there would be a mechanism by which they could say they didn't want that to continue. And I think that is probably the right way to handle it at the moment.
Yeah. Yes. So going back then to although I must admit I found some of it hard going to focus on and read through, and I could see things were essential, but maybe a bit boring. But that's not true of everything that's in, even in this draft. There are some parts to it that are quite aspirational, aren't there? And
Yes.
do you think that's so? Obviously, Elliot Bulmer thinks that that's okay to put in what's even just a provisional document. But what it struck me was that those bits that are a bit more aspirational, they're actually kind of what engage you emotionally.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And there's a drafting issue to be dealt with here too. I mean, it's quite difficult sometimes to make legal drafting exciting and inspirational. But there should be things in that constitutional, particularly a preamble, that should be exciting and inspirational. And we're still to do that, and we've still to make sure that happens. I mean, this is a process that isn't even halfway through yet, so that is to happen. I don't think it should be boring. I think it should be exciting, but equally, I don't think we should oversell it on the basis of this is the final word that we're going to have about everything, because we could get ourselves bogged down in an awful lot of debate and discussion and get nowhere. Whereas if we provide the reassurance and the vehicle, you could understand this as the vehicle that's going to take us the next step. There's a campaign. People vote for independence. The vehicle sets off. When we get to the day of independence, it is on the road, and it takes people through to the setting of the final constitution. And that final constitution, there's also mechanisms by which a final constitution can be changed, but they have to be pretty rigorous mechanisms. In the case of Ireland, there's a constitutional requirement for a referendum in these circumstances.
Yeah.
There's usually quite a heavy legislative bar, that you would have to have a pretty high bar before you could change the constitution, the final constitution.
Yes, and I mean that's just a good thing, isn't it? I mean, constitutions are not fail-safe. I mean, they can be tampered with. You see it in certain other countries. That's kind of happening or happened in the past, and hopefully we'd hope that wouldn't happen in Scotland. But obviously, it needs to be a pretty high bar to change things. I mean, one of the first things that came to my mind when we got the invite from you to join in this discussion. Was a sort of sense of this could be something that could really engage people, really kind of bring people together, but also create an even more of a sense of the country we belong to, the kind of nation that we want. like what the country
Yes.
stands for, what it actually what it doesn't stand for, and I find that really really exciting. Actually, I find it very moving. Actually,
No, absolutely. A constitution shouldn't be dry, and a constitution is an expression of who we think we are and where we stand in the world. And essentially we should be aspirational and positive and inclusive about that. Now, I just don't think we would probably can do it all at once.
yeah,
I think that that's something that we need to engage all our fellow citizens in, and that is best done after independence. But how do we get to that moment? And can we start it off? And I mean, I think the transitional constitution can also be inspirational. But yes, it's exciting because it's a definition of who we are. And it's also something we can rely on as citizens. I mean, one of the really difficult things, in the current UK setup is you can't really rely on anything. There's a hodgepodge of things that you could sort of think about, but there's nothing that you can pick up and open up and say, that is what guarantees me. That is what guarantees me, And people go around, in America, and they have constitutional problems with the Constitution. They have the Constitution there, and I think now there's also an example there of how sometimes things get out of date, set in stone, but have people become constitutionalists. They believe absolutely, and then you get other constitutions that are not observed. You can think of countries which have elaborate defenses for citizens which are simply ignored. So the Constitution has to be alive, and it has to be relevant, and has to be actively used. So that we want to make sure we have a document that can do that.
Yes, yes. I mean, I was thinking about America when I was thinking, well, yeah, like, the Second Amendment about the right to bear arms, which you could understand why it was in there at the time, but now it's just used as an absolute set in stone excuse for not being able to have proper controls on gun laws.
And people get a bit, people get fixated with some things. I mean, it is human nature to become fixated with things, and they get fixated with an element in it, and we have to guard against that. So we have to be very careful in what we write down and how we write it down, and how it gets enacted. And those are things you need to work. One of the things that helped to change my mind was a tremendous book about constitution making that came out, I think, 2 years ago, which really turned on its head all the expectations you had, and pointed out that some constitutions had been very regressive, very narrow things that actually damaged countries. So we need to be aware and conscious of all that too. And also in the 19th century, the great era of constitution making, where people made constitutions at the drop of a hat. That's now unusual for that to happen. So but we've got huge examples in front of us, and so much history that we know about, that we can, I hope, get this right.
Yes, and yes, indeed. And I mean, I found it interesting. Like recently, it's around the various yes groups meetings and kind of what have you, and every now and again you get someone, and they're talking about referring back to often a very old historical document, and then so it might be the Declaration of Arbroath, but there are other ones that are a bit more modern than that, but still quite old. So referring back to historical documents with the notion that, well, let's base our constitution on what's in those. Now, I sympathise with that. Again, I sympathise with that emotionally, especially the one about the Declaration of Arbroath. But is it really, is it really feasible to? We need a new constitution for a new country. So is it really? Yes, to what extent is it feasible to do that?
No, I mean, you said quite rightly. I think there are 50 pages in this one. Life is complicated, and it's more complicated than it was. And we must also be, fairly rigorous in our scholarship about what these old documents say. I mean, I on an emotional level, I'm happy to accept that the Declaration of Arbroath influenced the American Declaration of Independence. There is a fairly lively debate as to whether that was the case or not. And in actual fact, people will look at the claim of right and say probably more likely to have influenced it. So, I mean, the idea within the Declaration of Arbroath, although that also takes a little bit of pinch of salt with that, there was essentially a contracted kingship. And if somebody let you down, you got rid of them and you got somebody else, it's an absolutely right, it's a good idea that has stood the test of time. you know, I mean, there are other things and there are ways of expressing. You think, yeah, it's really interesting, but it's not actually relevant to where we are now.
Yeah.
I think you've got to bring an element of skepticism to this, but also an element of making sure that what we do is thought through carefully and is relevant now, but not so relevant now that it either becomes out of date or is a barrier to things happening. An example would be the place of an electoral commission. A modern constitution should tell you how your elections are held and should provide the framework to make sure that that happens in a free and fair manner. And therefore you will need, you know, in modern times, you will likely have an electoral commission, which is an independent body which supervises those elections. And you know, that does not exist in the Declaration of Our Birth, partly because there are no elections, you know.
Yes. So then coming to where we actually are now, obviously a very different place from 700 years ago, but where we actually are now. So do you think that maybe there should be some safeguards in place, even within this provisional document, just to safeguard against possibilities that might happen to rock, you know, probably the first 2 or 3 years of Scotland being independent. I mean, I'm thinking of things like property ownership. You know, if there was a sudden rush by property developers snapping up property, whether it's land or whether it's whether it's buildings, you know, land and who can buy it. Do you think there is some?
Well, I think you have
to
yeah, in those circumstances, you have to differentiate between what is in the Constitution and what is a political position held by political parties. So, you know, the constitutional issue there is how much land should individuals be able to own? And are there special circumstances and some places, perhaps, where even those provisions need to be looked at critically? Then there's a political issue of whether or not you want, you know, holiday homes to exist, you know, and you have to be careful not to conflate the two, because it's far too easy to say the constitutional position is that we should never have holiday homes. That's clearly not true. You know, that's legislating against holidays. But there are circumstances, and they've been discussed before, you know, discussed when the Land Commission was established. Is there a limit to how much land people should own? Should there be a ceiling to that? Should people be able to, you know, buy a percentage of things? Now, you know, I believe that there probably should be. And I think that is a debate that we continue to have in Scotland. There's also the question of if somebody does own a large bit of land, what are the rights of the people who live on that land? You know, and can those ever be taken away? And now that's actually largely land legislation. But there may be rights in terms of how people live in a community that needs to be enshrined in the Constitution. Now, we need a lot of thinking about this. I mean, I go back to what you said about it's a complicated document. The more you read it, the more you think about how what is appropriate for a constitution and what is appropriate for legislation and political debate. And then to make it further complicated, what's appropriate for a transitional constitution and what's appropriate for a final constitution. So we have all those debates to have, and we need to have them carefully and thoughtfully, and sometimes not in the political atmosphere of the present time, where, you know, if you say something, you're likely to be jumped on by 27 people on Twitter. So we need to watch out for that too.
Yeah. Yes, indeed. And that just brought to mind, actually, I came across it was on Twitter. It was just the other day. It was a tweet that Elliot Bulmer had put out, and the main point of the tweet was something else. But he mentioned that he mentioned one of his own books, which is called "Constitution for the Common Good," and I just saw the title of that and thought, that hits the spot, doesn't it? I mean, if you've got a constitution and the one that we end up, provisional one to begin with, and then a final one, and people can look at it in Scotland and go, okay, well, maybe don't agree with everything in that, but they can see that it is a document that's attempting to do that. That would be quite an accomplishment to have brought about. I'm
really keen that bodies and individuals and bodies that are involved in this come to it with a spirit of goodwill, not in a partisan fashion, but, you know, and so far so good. as you know, there's been a couple of meetings we've had. A couple of them, people have been a bit doubtful as to whether it started off, doubtful whether this was the right thing to do. I think also contributes to a sense that we are all working together on something important. The Independence Project is an important project. We need to find a way to work together on that, despite our differences. And our movement has been a bit rocky at times in recent times, because sometimes that's not been the case. And I keep saying when I'm at things and where I'm at things, like the rally in Arbroath a couple of weeks ago, there's much more that unites us and divides us.
Yeah.
If we can work practically on things together, then we can lose the demonization. But we also have to do it with mutual respect, and that's certainly what we've seen in the constitution process. Everybody has respected each other's positions. Now, we're going to have some pretty intense horse trading, I suspect, when we come to the second draft. But I think that will hold, because I think people will respect each other and know that there are different points of view. And you've got a bit of an ideological spread too. You've got some people will take very strong positions. Good. I hope I can hold the jackets for long enough for us to get to the second stage, and then we'll see where we go.
Yes. Well, I'm sort of left feeling about it. It's just a prize, that constitution in the end is a prize that's really, really worthwhile, striving for and putting in effort and thought into it. And, I really appreciate hearing how your own views over time have changed on that. And thanks for coming and talking to us here today. And yeah, and obviously I'll see you in the next of those meetings. Great having you.
I hope you will be getting stuff after the local elections, and we'll take it on from there. It's running slower than I wanted, but then everything does. Yeah. But I think we've got a good thing that we can achieve here, and I think we can find a way to do it. So thank you for taking part in it. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Thanks. Thank you. And the cat looks very comfortable there in the background.
Well, untroubled by constitutionalism.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks very much, Mike.